Prime Minister Mark Carney finally announces his defense budget. Can the state go digital? Greta Thunberg is seized in international waters by the Israelis. Welcome to Radical Priorities, episode 34. I'm Aidan Clark.
I'm Ben Parkins.
So, the big defense announcement came yesterday from Mark Carney, looking at about $8 to $9 billion put aside, found. Obviously, people are wondering where exactly the money's going to come from, whether Carney's going to raise taxes, whether he's going to borrow more. That is as yet unclear. There's been some quote unquote clever accounting. The Coast Guard has been moved from the fisheries to become part of actually part of the Canadian military. Um, Generally, the money's for retrofitting naval vessels, buying more jets, increasing defense spending to 2% of the GDP, hoping to reach those much asked for NATO commitments. But on the whole, it's just Carney following through on statements like he's been trying to do with energy, with housing, and now he's done it with defense.
hmm Yeah, and so I was wondering, the difference I think for most Canadians, as it is for me, is that obviously this is kind of almost like an economic show of force where they really want to hit the ground running and prove that they can do clever accounting like this, find money to really do things, put the money to work. Um, but for an average Canadian, what does it mean for us to meet NATO targets early versus do something like build housing or improve the energy grid?
Well, there's lots of skepticism about whether they can even find the money in a sense without this is the paradox, right? Without kind of disturbing the existing economic variables, right? When you're borrowing, say, that's a risk. When you're raising taxes, that's another political risk. And it's always going to be this question of whether or not Carney has the room, sort of politically or socially, to maneuver such that he can begin to, and this is obviously the goal, reconstitute the global order with less American effectively dominance. And so this is sort of his approach. The defense piece of the puzzle as it relates to say housing, which is a domestic issue, whereas defense is more of a right foreign policy issue. I mean, it's both. It's literally on the border. Um, but the relationship between housing and defense is that Carney needs to stabilize the global order. He needs to be part of a strategy that goes against what's happening right now in the United States, and it's going to be with the Europeans. It's going to be with other Commonwealth countries, with the UK, with Pacific partnerships, trying to get back effectively that financial stability. Why do I say financial stability as opposed to say military stability? Well, let's be precise here, right? The Americans have a big military, but their most important tool is their dollar. And their military exists to reinforce the US dollar supremacy abroad, to ensure that commercial activity is never interrupted, that there's sort of safety on the seas, in the skies, on land. That's why people have militaries to protect effectively largely commercial relationships. So figuring out defense is basically part of figuring out housing or figuring out the average Canadian's, affordability contract, for instance, insofar as if you want to get back stability, say in markets, right? If you've got all these tariffs coming down on you and people don't know where to put their money, or people who are hedging their money or thought they should hedge their money in the Trump administration are regretting doing so, whatever it might be, providing that much needed stability for long-term investments. And by extension, and this is a major part, of course, of Carney's Catalyst program, attracting tons of foreign direct investment into Canada, defense is a major part of that puzzle. We've seen the Europeans do this. More than a few months ago, they earmarked almost $250 billion, and we discussed it on the podcast because lots of people, particularly on the left, economic commentators, were saying, well, how do they just find $250 billion? Why would we put that into the green transition or into other forms of infrastructure? Or why are we not using it to shore up our affordability issues? One of the obvious, or one of the problems is that the system runs on debt. It runs on enormous amounts of debt. And one of the great optimistic responses to the big new defense budget as it was issued by basically the European Union as a whole was, oh, look, countries like Germany have actually, that are going to allow themselves to take on more debt. Germany has very, very tight fiscal uh, uh, policies and laws. So they were going to allow themselves to make more debt. And everyone was saying, what a triumph. We'll have awesome German debt on the market.
Mhm.
And people love to own the debt of stable countries, like the Americans, and Germans, etc. And so it's particularly good when they're willing to produce debt. But I feel like we should look at the issue of this $750 billion through the issue of why the Germans are suddenly changing their strategy rather than this being a great boon for financial markets and for debt markets. Perhaps it should have the opposite response. If even, the very fiscally conservative Germany is having to use credit to get anything done, and we're seeing slowdowns in their manufacturing sector. We're seeing the social unrest in their politics. I think that their movement into a more credit dependent society at the same time and earmarking it exclusively for debt clearly suggests that there's a relationship here between uh, massive borrowing and massive spending on defense. In other words, we can only borrow when we spend it on defense.
Mhm.
Unless just like the Europeans, Carney has the exact same problem. Unless he's using the money, using the debt to reinforce all of the axioms of the global order, the money's not necessarily available. And it's not a question of whether the actual money is there to be borrowed, but whether or not it's a good quote unquote investment, right? Whether or not in building up investment in defense in this way is actually going to attract um, a reflective sense of confidence in the Canadian government. Let's recall, like the rhetoric that Carney is using is basically the era of U.S. dominance is over, right? So this is this explicit project that we've been seeing. It's a financial project, it's a trade project, and now it's a defense project to try and recreate, renegotiate the center of where power is going to rest, and how the global economy is ultimately going to stabilize itself. And ultimately, the idea is this one. In market society, the announcement that I'm going to spend $10 billion in this sector or $50 billion on that industry is more important than what actually shows up. The quality of those jet fighters, the quality of whatever is produced is irrelevant because all of the commercial activity starts once I announce we're going to put $10 billion, because there's a series of bets, like a series of dominoes that are triggered. Once I said $10 billion in the Canadian government, well, suddenly people are going to be betting on the Canadian dollar, betting on Canadian debt. Maybe they're going to bet on the Canadian housing market while they're at it. Why not? Because it's part of Carney's contract. They're going to start betting on whatever weapons suppliers are going to be delivering to the Canadians, or the radio technologies, or the sonar, or the submarines, or the naval vessels. All of these things we bet on massive amounts of financial activity on the basis of increased investor confidence in all of the associated industries. This is what it means to be in a financialized system. The downside is that when your emphasis actually needs to be on a hardened, resilient, materially sound logistical product, which absolutely is in defense, but also in any sector we're looking at, whether it's energy, housing, etc., it's very difficult if all of the commercial activity, all of the important economic stuff happens before anything actually hits the ground, literally. And then by the time, the naval vessels arrive, or whatever the shipment of materials, the quality is irrelevant. And in fact, it's a cycle, right? Then, as a company, weapons dealer, I put less and less proper investment into research and development, into generating that material resiliency in the underlying products themselves, because I know that I can just engage in the debt game. That is market society. Continue to, make big announcements, deliver shipments 5 years down the line. Oh, there's probably endless delays. Who knows what? Will there even be a war in which we make use of these things? Is it just a kind of arms race, a sort of shoulder touting? Impossible to say. As long as the debt continues to flow and people can continue to bet on these giant debt plays, to most people's mind, the global economy is healthy. Of course, I think on the podcast we know a lot better than that.
Right. Well, I think that's kind of what we always come back to with Carney is that he's been talking forever about how as we repeat and as he repeats, moving from market to moral sentiments in this way, but without, of course, the dissolution of markets or thinking post market. Um, I think we've said it many, many times that he really likes markets and he thinks that they can work for us. And he can sort of, play power broker in this way that positions Canada in a better spot than it would be under someone else, which might be true. But any position that's in this global financialized system, I think we understand, puts us in a pretty precarious position. And so, yeah, whenever I hear about this stuff, it's not terribly exciting, and it certainly doesn't feel radical.
Susie Geiger, a professor at UC Dublin, released an analysis in the Globe and Mail this week, looking sort of the most fleshed out version I've ever seen of what a privatized government or a digitized government would actually look like. Obviously, given Musk has just left Doge, I'm not quite sure what's actually going to happen to Doge itself. I think that remains as yet unclear. But his contract basically ran out. There have been tons of spats on Twitter and Truth Social between Trump, or X rather, and Truth Social between Trump and Elon. Um, but it's very brief, but it's an extraordinary precise assessment of what exactly is the tech philosophy when it comes to the state. And basically the idea is this: let's digitize every part of the state. So you have your data, your health data, for instance, whatever data that concerns you, you have it. It's siloed under your control. Things like your citizenship are things that you should be allowed to give to whomever you wish, whether it's you and some of your other buddies, or a group of 5 million people, or something as large as, say, an actual state. Some people have pretensions to actually go and buy land and have it be backed by cryptocurrency. But the fundamental idea is, first of all, we're going to digitize. You're going to continue digitizing your data, digitize your citizenship, and then it's all going to be backed by crypto. It's going to be backed by the digitized private monetary system that is cryptocurrency. And this will effectively remove the need for a physical state, remove the need, as far as I can tell, for institutions, even for public social services. Right now, all services will be in markets. Private actors will facilitate all things which government in the past had done. Central banks will become irrelevant, and probably over time, even again, the idea of a physical state will seem irrelevant. Everyone will just sort of exist in some sort of generic physical space, moderated by digital services, digital capital, digital data.
Hmm. I mean, it's fascinating to me that again we often see, and we speak about it a lot on the podcast, that almost that horseshoe theory thing ends up coming true, where people become almost so in favor of privatization and what we would maybe call sort of right wing economic positions, that they find these incredibly kind of almost progressive ideas. I mean, we talk all the time about Yanis Varoufakis, who we're both big fans of, who's also in favor of digitizing large parts of society, digitizing large parts of government. These ideas of parallel payment systems that exist to undo the control that banking has over citizens' money, all these things. Um, but it just seems so on the surface to me incredibly irresponsible, basically, to have this run by private enterprise. Um, and the reason I say this is that I think that people have some kind of idea, and we see it all the time in terms of talking points that uh, you know we're being impeded constantly by the government. We're being impeded by red tape and by having to do a land acknowledgement before you build a condo or whatever is the reason why your condo is so expensive and is built with such crappy materials in some strange way. But obviously, I think that we know that that's not the case, and I think that we see in general, as we've mentioned a lot, that things are kind of tilting towards the bottom by and large. I think we see this with the rise of, Temu and Alibaba and sort of knockoffs. I mean, at this point, we've even seen in the post tariff era when luxury companies were even saying, "Oh, actually, yeah, we do use crappy materials, and it doesn't mean anything." And so my thinking, anytime I hear you know, Doge or Palantir or whomever should be running some kind of version of a societal decision-making matrix that, uninhibits us in this way the government has. I just think it's kind of a race to the bottom. And I'm certainly not in favor of it personally.
Well, you're right that this cheapness factor is actually extremely expensive, and we've reached the point where it's grossly expensive. where emphasis on every input being cheap has now resulted in a series of kind of excessive or unexpected expenses. Whether it's just sort of anecdotally things not lasting long enough, but imagine you scale that up to an industrial process, or imagine you try, yeah, and build a housing market when the same principles that apply to building to manufacturing clothing apply to the manufacturing of houses. And yet, sure, you get these race to the bottoms thing, but you also get this challenge that there's not necessarily any form of private enterprise that can overcome the strict and rigorous demands of commercial activity. What there is are certain sectors, and tech is a great example, and actually to an extent defense, where there's this explosion of what's called growth potential. And this growth potential can float a certain amount of innovation, float a certain amount of capital, a certain amount of interest, a certain amount of enthusiasm. And let's not forget that that enthusiasm is crucial. We just discussed it in defense. That enthusiasm is the announcement that gets all the debt moving. But by the time that enthusiasm dies down and a product actually has to arrive, 90% of these products exactly are the proprietors and the manufacturers of these products looking at what they've created. And
Right.
when you globalize a production line and you take away all the agency behind the design, or to an extent, actually, the consumer interaction with the products, they're coming from God knows where. um, it becomes very difficult to imagine um, reintroducing any kind of social and or political factor where choice is now coming into it, and then markets become the obvious regulator, the obvious sort of passive thing that won't risk the interruption to this passive system of global management and global production.
Mm.
And that's exactly what you see with these kinds of private negotiations with government. I mean, Musk has this line. He says, don't optimize something that shouldn't exist in the first place." And I wonder if, in a strange way, this should apply to his comments in government. Maybe he should go to the end and fully reject, the container that is the state. And what that means is certainly rejecting a version of the state. I mean, cryptocurrency is a good example. The use of cryptocurrency is based upon a radical misunderstanding right now of how the money supply and how the monetary system works. There's this assumption that all of the money is coming from the central banks, when the opposite is the case. 96% of it is produced by private banks. Now, it's all created in the name of the people, right? It's created effectively by the central government. But it's not all printed. All the money that exists digitally is simply not printed. Very little of it is. In other words, private banks have the power to create money, as it were, out of thin air. And the idea then that cryptocurrency is this answer to how we have this kind of rogue authority, this anti-democratic authority that claims it's neutral, called the central bank. And cryptocurrency and the blockchain are the answer because we can decentralize the creation of money is bogus. It's bogus because it misunderstands the fact that it's the private manipulation and hijacking of the monetary system, which is so unbelievably fatal, and yet that to which we are addicted. Try having your big announcements. Try generating your growth potential, having your market enthusiasm without enormous amounts of debt. That debt has to come from somewhere. It comes in the form of money, obviously. It comes in the form of money that is effectively privately created, but then becomes a public responsibility when it all crashes in a financial crisis. Guess what? It's not the private banks who are responsible for all the money they've just been engaged in creating, because effectively they've had the virtual and tacit permission of the central banks. So when you think that, again, the problem is, say, efficiency and cheapness, or on the other hand, or alongside that, decentralization, the failure of centralization, which goes along with this idea of backlogs. That the government has this is just too inefficient. First of all, government's been around for thousands of years. I'm not sure what makes our period so special that we finally reach the inefficiency, or we all read the Gulag Archipelago, so therefore, the government sucks. I
Yeah.
mean, go back to the modern state in the Tudor era 500 years ago. It might have been autocratic, but it was anything but inefficient. The fucking Romans invented bureaucracy. So we're misunderstanding what the problems are. We've created a series of phantoms the phantom of cheapness and the phantom of efficiency and the phantom of decentralization. And not only are they all based upon misunderstandings, such as the fact that we think that cheapness is cheap, whereas it's actually extremely expensive to maintain a global system of cheap supply, right? It's the global part that is expensive
Mm,
and the long term consequences of cheap materials. And in the case of centralization, yeah, if you neuter a government, if you make a government every 5 years responsible for a financial crisis that is generated by the private financial system, right? And on top of that, you pile policies of austerity and you neutralize politics. I don't know if the government has a lot to say, and rehabilitating the government is not necessarily the next step in that question. What we should be asking is, well, what has the government represented? What does it mean to have social institutions? What does it mean that we had something like Social Security, that we have universal health care? If we're interested in those things, can we guarantee them without the growth contract of the post-war period and without the growth contract of the neoliberal period of massive financial and commercial activity, of global supply chains? That's the challenge right now, not to digitize government, but to think about how digitization can actually radically increase the capacity for these services and these social systems to exist, I would argue, once again.
right. Well, I think that we're both certainly in favor of these things not being stripped and not being removed. I mean, I think that's kind of the point that I was getting at as well, is that, we talk about when the defense companies finally deliver the thing and they haven't looked at it and it underperforms or it's broken. I mean, imagine that is I mean, a fighter jet is very consequential. Imagine that that is your healthcare system, your education system, your social security, which we've already seen with, our current government. I understand that the frustration comes that we feel those things aren't working currently. But I think the idea that you'll get something better out of a deal with sort of private enterprise and undoing some kind of state solution, some public solution, I think is kind of a total farce.
Not only when these things are already massively done in by private hands, whether it's certain parts of the healthcare system in Canada or the entire healthcare system in the United States, whether it's our defense systems, even again, I mean, everything from in terms of our social security relies upon us having a functional wage system, us having a functional revenue system. If we don't have, if those systems don't function, which they basically don't right now and haven't for decades, we can't really have social security. We don't even have the contract of citizenship that you pay into a system. But again, maybe it's important to make this distinction between the state and the public. And maybe this is a helpful distinction, in order to try and come up with a concept for something that includes these collective social responsibilities, but to an extent can move beyond this instrument, which we call the state, that clearly is unbelievably pliable and easily turned into an instrument for private interests.
Greta Thunberg, the famous climate activist, was recently detained in international waters on a flotilla bound for Gaza. Her and a number of other activists were detained by the Israeli state police after it was, they approached Gaza. They were part of a flotilla that was effectively there to show support and to bring aid. She was detained. She's now back in France. So she's no longer being detained by Israel. It's unclear what they're going to do moving forward. But I think it speaks to this thing that people really want this issue, the Israel Gaza issue, to matter in a really significant way on both sides. So you have people on the left on sort of the Gaza side, um, speaking more to the fact that they need people to admit that it's a genocide, that there is state sponsored violence, that Israel has this violent history that's not being acknowledged. And then, of course, on the Israeli side, there's been a call to kind of disavow Hamas, disavow terrorism, violence in a really significant way. Um, but it seems to me that what's really interesting about it is to ask yourself why someone like Greta is there, and why there's sort of a shift from something like climate activism to anti-genocidal activism. Because it's kind of interesting. It in a way seems like they weren't able to achieve their climate activism in the way that maybe they wanted to. I know that there is a big push in across the world for the green transition, but we know that it's not happening in such a meaningful way. And so it does seem like it is the sort of new cause du jour, not in the fact that I think that people don't care about it, but that it is sort of something to attach yourself to and something that people sort of really need it to mean something, so that they can have something meaningful, in a kind of an interesting way.
One question might be, can you read Palestine through the climate crisis? Is that the more interesting way of going? And I mean, right now, I don't know if that means reading Palestine through, reading, rising sea level or the threat of drought. Of course, there are all sorts of impending, the reports of impending famine in Gaza. But I think the point would more be, first of all, you have to try and ask the question, why has the green transition not happened? Most people don't really know. It's been co-opted massively by governments all around the world. So why isn't it not working? Well, it turns out one, debt isn't an answer for two reasons. Reasons we already know. Debt isn't itself enough. It's not a monetary problem. It's a design problem. It's an infrastructure problem. You can't pay your way out. And even if you could, the cost of things, the cost of our expensive global system is currently baked in to the infrastructure costs, to the energy transition costs. But in particular, there's so much money that is baked into the system, into massively inflated assets, housing markets, for instance, money we can't just take out. As you try to take it out, you crash the system. So this is, in this sense, there's an era going from Palestine to the climate crisis to some resolution to some broader debt crisis. And on the debt crisis, I do actually think climate change is a lot more insightful than Palestine, at least insofar as the climate crisis is an invitation to accept that the human being has so decentered normal ecological causality. The Anthropocene era is nature without nature is a good description of it. Sort of something called material reality still exists, but we seem to have displaced, the very slow process of natural exchange and generation, which was anything but simple or straightforward. Um, and therefore, we have an enormous social responsibility. And this is definitely something Greta has missed. And this is in what respect the era goes back and back to Palestine. So, what's the social responsibility that we didn't take up in the climate crisis that we're trying to negotiate through the war in Gaza? And I think that the social responsibility probably does not have to do with a Palestinian state as such. Probably doesn't have to do with a history of violence on either side, um, and a lot more to do with, well, you know, uh, is Israel at the moment, the answer to the global order? Much of the support of the West for Israel has very little to do, I think we have to admit, with um, the Jewish cause, with the question of Jewish identity, which is how it's framed, any more than leftists supporting Palestine. Really has to do with Palestinians, for that matter. What Israel represents is a linchpin for the global order itself. There was a recent defacement of the National Holocaust Museum in Ottawa with the words "Feed me," a clear reference to the impending famine in Gaza and to the restriction of aid on the part of the Israelis. But one question we might ask is, why does the Holocaust represent such a signal event? And it's very simple, because it's the event that spurred on the design of the global order. It's the event that led to the Americans' effective economic takeover of Europe. The Marshall Plan was anything but a generous loan program. It was a complex assertion of political authority. It was the beginning of American dominance in the modern sense. So, Israel is the answer by extension that the global order has, going back to the catastrophe that was the Holocaust. If there's something which the left have failed to do, it's to take responsibility for two things then. One, the Holocaust, you know, they should have a description of it. Oftentimes in political struggles, what happens is you reject the terms themselves, the setting and context of the people who sit across from you. You question their context. I'm not sure why any leftist would question the context of the Holocaust. And if you don't understand the Holocaust, then you're not really going to understand. Even if you're a total cynic and say, well, does Netanyahu and his cabinet even care about the Holocaust or not? They're just using it as a pawn. It's irrelevant. It exerts an enormous psychic and ideological influence. And the second thing, therefore, is, well, what's holding the global order together? Under the threat of tariffs and financial crisis and the war in Ukraine, the global order needs certain things to center itself around, shamelessly sometimes. Look at the defense contracts that we've been discussing. And the truth is that, Israel, or having a strategy for the Middle East, or having an answer to Iran or Saudi Arabia, is a vital part of how the machinery of the global order negotiates itself. So if there is some assessment as to why there's such a deadlock, why this conflict cannot seem to resolve itself even at the level of public discourse, why there's such a level of incoherence even within the positions that people are taking themselves, it's probably for many of the reasons that we've identified in issues that might seem superficially external to Israel. If there's a slowdown in global commerce, in global trade, I can assure you that that reflects into a slowdown in the global order, and that by extension, there isn't a clear belief that Israel is necessarily the answer. The same thing holds for Ukraine. I mean, right? We marshal huge defense plans and treaties and even politics of consent in order to unify resources and debt and public support. But we rely, therefore, on very clear unifying crises.
Mhm.
And so when there's a collapse in the public discourse, I think the last thing we should do is try and cut through it with an extremely moral position, which I think unfortunately Greta's flotilla does somewhat represent, but try and understand why even those in power cannot seem to generate an entirely coherent position about, what does Israel represent as far as the pieces of the puzzle of the global order.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that maybe people forget about sort of the determination factor of what happened post Holocaust, that it was such a huge crisis and it was so different than anything else that had happened. I mean, there had been genocides and massacres and, there was a First World War, but it was such a shock and it was such a crisis that needed to be dealt with that it really, as you say, determined the global order, the financial order, the political order that we're still feeling the ramifications of. But there's an element of it that it's almost like, all of those things sort of needed to happen. This modernism, globalism, all of these things that it was, I hesitate to say almost like a fortunate coincidence that something that was such a crisis in this way yielded that response. I find that now, I think people, are feeling a similar crisis in the global order, in the way that things are organized, in the way that their lives are spent. That there is a look towards this from both sides as the kind of crisis that should once again kind of overdetermine the way that we structure the global order in this way. And so I understand, from both positions why they would look to this and ascribe so much meaning and ascribe so much value. Um, but I don't know that it's the issue that happens in the same way. And again, I think it's the same thing where, there's this difficulty with sort of modes of expression, especially nowadays, that often relate to consumption. We see this all the time. We talked about, Zizek's explanation of, when the ethical is factored into the price, that this puts you in the trap of consuming your way to freedom, right? Consuming the right things. I think we see it in the same way of, you shouldn't listen to music that's by the wrong artist. It's still sort of a form of consumption as your only way of moral expression because so many things have been sort of stripped from you, that it's no shock that you see it in this way. Although in the same sense as green energy, it's a very difficult thing. I am almost incapable of consuming energy in a way that is green because I don't have solar panels on my building, but I can sort of vote for someone who says that we should have more solar panels such that maybe one day my building is retrofitted. I think in the same way, you can't live in a country or go to a university that doesn't in some way facilitate, arms going to Israel, or in some way, sort of help structure this global order that you disagree with. And I think that people are just sort of very lost in how to express themselves or organize themselves morally and ethically in this way.
Maybe one way of putting it is that their problem is not with this conflict in Gaza. Their conflict is with this thing called the global order, the contract of consumption that comes with it, the financial power that underpins it, the sense of powerlessness that of course is daily experienced within it, and that therefore there is a sort of shameless use of the crisis in Gaza to sort of say, oh no, this is when the system's gone too far, as if there weren't a series of steps that didn't already lead to this. And I suppose this is your point about, the Holocaust was the, let's call it again, to use this very, very ironic term, fortunate coincidence for the global order from their perspective, shamelessly a fortunate coincidence, not a
Yes.
fortunate coincidence in any sense for humanity. Um, and of course, we see the same logic playing out. I mean, I'll just be ruthless here and say on the left and wanting to use, I think, Palestine as a kind of, with this reverse causality, right? Once we get Palestine dealt with, we can deal with everything else. But it seems as if the opposite is probably the case. Um, and yet the same is true of the Israelis and the supporters for Israel. They also want this to be their crisis. And maybe why they're more on the back foot is that they are making the claim that, well, everything's fine until you did this. You know what I mean? And I think that this is not only deeply ignorant of 70 years of history in the region, it's ignorant of, again, Israel's part to play in what we're calling a little bit nebulously the global order. I suppose then the opportunity is to stop trying to convert an event into the event, which on which basis you'll be able to ground your politics, but maybe resisting the temptation to become ethical here might actually be the only appropriate way to become political. Otherwise, you end up fetishizing crisis and crises, and I mean, it has to be said that the Holocaust for many people was caused by modernity, and therefore the modernity that followed almost right then has, again, to use this deeply ironic phrase, has this kind of fortunate coincidence to it, as if it was a step along the way of modernity. Really, what the Holocaust probably should have provoked is the opposite of the Marshall Plan, the opposite of the vast Americanization of the global order, and instead a total mentality checked and a mindset reset as far as, well, what kind of global order can we even create after these dark projects, um, and does it make sense to simply indulge the worst of the commercial contracts and the mechanization, and creating a European Union that can imagine itself to be post-war, of course, which was laughable considering the fact that the Cold War, of course, was only beginning after the destruction of Europe. So it was impossible for the European Union to be constructed in any other way than in a half-finished way. And many people will know that, of course, the European Union is unfinished. It has a monetary dimension, but no federal dimension, no larger political setup. Some people would say this is good. We want it to be decentralized, but of course, the European Union is anything but decentralized. It's massively and unconsciously, and therefore very dangerously centralized. So, if I were again in the shoes of someone looking to support Palestine or Israel, for that matter, you have to look at these histories and say, well, how could we have done things differently already, not to have arrived at this point, and how unexpectedly have been certain concepts of wealth, certain concepts of statehood, which of course are recycled in things like the two-state solution, as if let's just go back to the old-fashioned good global liberal order, and everything will be solved, when maybe that was already both a mistaken solution in the post-war case and maybe a mistaken interpretation of the Holocaust on the part of the global order in the first place. In some respect, we've never really come up with a satisfactory answer for the 20th century as a whole, and I think the ghosts of it still haunt us to this day.
This has been Radical Priorities, episode 34. I'm Ben Parkins.
I'm Aidan Clark.
Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.